11:47 p.m. The studio lights were dimmed low, just enough to cast long shadows across the mixing console. The red LED on the tape machine blinked softly, like a heartbeat holding its breath. Michael Jackson leaned forward, one gloved hand resting on the faders, his face half hidden beneath the brim of a black fedora. Across from him stood Quincy Jones, composer, producer, mentor, architect of some of the most successful albums in human history. For 15 years, this room had been their battlefield and their sanctuary. Tonight, it would become the place where everything ended. Michael broke the silence. "I want you to understand something." Quincy froze. Not because the words were loud. Not because Michael raised his voice. But because of how quietly, deliberately, and unmistakably final they were. This was not the Michael Quincy had known. And at 11:47 p.m., music history shifted forever. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another untold story. For the world, Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones were inseparable. Their names were spoken in the same breath, etched together in gold plaques and Grammy history. Off the Wall reintroduced Michael Jackson as a solo force. Thriller shattered every commercial ceiling the industry thought existed. Bad turned perfection into an expectation. Quincy was the master craftsman. Michael was the once-in-a-century instrument. But behind the accolades, behind the synchronized brilliance, there was a tension most people never saw. Because while Quincy Jones believed he was guiding a genius, Michael Jackson believed he was slowly being confined by one. The seeds of that night were planted years earlier, quietly, invisibly, during moments no camera ever captured. Michael Jackson was obsessed with sound in a way that bordered on supernatural. He didn't just hear music, he inhabited it. He could isolate frequencies other producers missed. He felt rhythm spatially, like architecture. By the late 1980s, after Bad, Michael had begun to feel something dangerous creeping into his creative life: predictability. The formulas that once felt revolutionary now felt like walls closing in. Quincy, on the other hand, trusted structure. He trusted discipline. He trusted the proven path because it had never failed them before. 3 albums, 3 cultural earthquakes. History didn't argue with results. But Michael Jackson wasn't chasing results anymore. He was chasing freedom. What Quincy didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that for 6 months before that night, Michael had been recording in secret. Late-night sessions, alternate studios, engineers sworn to silence. DAT tapes labeled in Michael's handwriting, hidden away like contraband. Music that didn't sound like Thriller. Music that didn't obey radio rules. Music that didn't ask permission. Michael was building something Quincy had never approved, never guided, never shaped. And that terrified Quincy Jones, because it meant, for the first time, Michael Jackson didn't need him. The conversation that unfolded that night was not an argument. It was something colder, more surgical. A psychological chess match between 2 men who loved music but no longer wanted the same future. Quincy listened as Michael spoke, not with the eager gratitude of a protege, but with the calm certainty of a man who had already made his decision. Michael told Quincy he felt unheard, that his instincts were being filtered through someone else's expectations, that every time he pushed toward something darker, stranger, more personal, it was redirected back into what was safe. Quincy countered with experience, with legacy, with the reminder that the world didn't just listen to Michael Jackson, it consumed him. That responsibility demanded restraint. Michael didn't argue. Instead, he reached for the tape machine. What he played next would haunt Quincy Jones long after he left that room. The track that filled the studio speakers didn't sound like anything they'd done before. The rhythm was jagged, aggressive, almost confrontational. The harmonies were layered in unconventional ways. The lyrics, raw, defiant, cut through the air like broken glass. This wasn't Michael Jackson asking to be understood. This was Michael Jackson demanding it. Quincy didn't interrupt, he didn't critique, he didn't reach for the console. He stood completely still. Because in that moment he realized something devastating. Michael Jackson had already crossed the bridge. The music wasn't a demo, it wasn't a pitch, it was a declaration of independence. And Quincy Jones knew, deep down, that if this music went into the world, his era with Michael was over. Michael stopped the tape. That silence was heavier than any argument could have been. "I needed you to hear it from me," Michael said softly. "Not from the charts, not from the press." Quincy nodded slowly. What neither of them said out loud was the truth they both understood. Greatness, when fully realized, often outgrows its origins. Their partnership didn't end with a handshake or a slammed door. It ended with mutual recognition, painful, respectful, irreversible. Michael Jackson walked out of that studio not as a student, not as a collaborator, but as something far more dangerous to the industry. An artist with nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. In the years that followed, the world would hear the consequences of that night: music that challenged systems, lyrics that confronted power, sounds that refused to sit comfortably inside genre lines. Michael Jackson became more confrontational, more experimental, more alone. Quincy Jones would later speak with pride and distance about their work together. The admiration never disappeared, but the closeness did. Because sometimes the cost of perfection is separation. That night at 11:47 p.m. was not a fight, it was a farewell. A quiet ending to one of the most influential collaborations in music history. And a reminder that even legends must eventually choose between comfort and truth. Michael Jackson chose truth. The door didn't slam when Michael Jackson left the studio that night. It closed softly. Too softly. Quincy Jones stood alone for a long moment, staring at the console they had shared for over a decade. The faders were still warm beneath his fingertips. The air still carried the faint echo of Michael's voice, suspended like dust in a beam of low studio light. Quincy had spent his entire life reading rooms, reading musicians, reading silence. And this silence told him everything. Because silence in that room meant the partnership was already over. Michael Jackson never announced the split publicly. There was no press release, no dramatic interview, no official statement. The world simply woke up one day and realized something had changed. The albums that followed no longer bore Quincy Jones' fingerprints. The sonic architecture felt sharper, more angular, more confrontational. It wasn't evolution by accident. It was intentional. And it terrified the industry. For years, executives had believed Michael Jackson was the perfect storm, once-in-a-lifetime talent guided by once-in-a-lifetime supervision. Quincy Jones wasn't just a producer, he was seen as a stabilizer, the adult in the room, the bridge between genius and mass appeal. Without Quincy, many believed Michael would drift. They were wrong. What happened after that night was not chaos. It was control. Michael Jackson began assembling a new inner circle: engineers, programmers, collaborators who listened more than they directed. People who understood that Michael didn't need to be taught how to make hits. He needed to be allowed to tell the truth as he heard it in his head. But freedom came with a cost. For the first time in his career, Michael was completely alone at the top. And loneliness changes people. Those secret recordings Michael had played for Quincy were just the beginning. Over the following months, Michael spent countless nights in studios that barely appeared on official schedules. Some sessions ran until sunrise. Others ended with him scrapping entire tracks minutes before completion. Perfection wasn't the goal anymore. Expression was. Engineers later recalled how Michael would sometimes stop a track mid-playback, close his eyes and say, "That's not honest yet, not wrong, not off-key." not poorly mixed, not honest. It was a terrifying standard. Without Quincy Jones acting as a counterweight, Michael Jackson's creative instincts intensified. His themes grew darker, his lyrics more personal. Paranoia, injustice, isolation, power, betrayal. Ideas that had once been softened for mainstream palatability now stood front and center. The world would eventually hear this shift most clearly in the early 1990s. But what few people understood was that the emotional blueprint for that era was forged the moment Michael said, "I want you to understand something." That sentence wasn't about music. It was about identity. Michael Jackson had spent his entire life being interpreted by his father, by Motown, by the press, by the public. Even Quincy, with all his brilliance, saw Michael through a lens shaped by success metrics and audience expectations. But Michael wanted something different. He wanted to be understood on his own terms. That desire, to be seen as an artist, not a product, became the engine driving everything that followed. Quincy Jones, meanwhile, carried the weight of that night quietly. In interviews years later, he would speak of Michael with deep respect, even affection. But there was always a pause when the subject turned to their separation, a moment where words slowed, as if navigating terrain still emotionally charged. Because Quincy knew something few others did. He had witnessed the exact moment Michael Jackson stopped asking for approval. And that moment changed everything. The industry noticed immediately. Without Quincy's name attached, skepticism crept in. Could Michael maintain his dominance without the producer who helped shape his greatest hits? Would audiences follow him into darker, more challenging territory? Michael didn't respond with explanations. He responded with sound. What emerged from those post-Quincy sessions was not music designed to comfort. It was music designed to confront. Aggressive beats, fragmented structures, lyrics that accused, questioned, and demanded accountability. Michael Jackson was no longer trying to be liked. He was trying to be heard. This shift unsettled fans who had grown up with the immaculate sheen of Thriller-era perfection. But for Michael, it felt like breathing for the first time. Yet freedom came at a psychological cost. Without Quincy Jones as a trusted filter, Michael became his own harshest critic. Sessions stretched longer. Revisions became endless. Songs were rebuilt dozens of times. Entire albums were nearly scrapped because they didn't align with the emotional truth Michael felt at that moment. Perfectionism turned inward. Friends and collaborators noticed the change. Michael laughed less in studios. He listened more intently. When he spoke, it was often about meaning, intention, legacy. He was no longer asking, "Will this work?" He was asking, "Will this last?" That question haunted him. Because Michael Jackson understood something most artists don't realize until too late. Commercial success fades. Influence endures. The night he spoke those words to Quincy Jones was the night he chose influence over safety. And history would prove him right. But not without consequences. As Michael's music became more personal, so did the scrutiny surrounding him. The same fearlessness that drove his artistic independence also made him vulnerable. Without the protective buffer of a long-standing collaborator like Quincy, Michael stood exposed to an industry eager to exploit every crack in his armor. Criticism intensified, headlines sharpened, speculation turned cruel. And yet, through it all, Michael never publicly regretted that night. Because regret would have meant betraying the truth, he finally allowed himself to speak. Years later, people would ask, what if Quincy and Michael had stayed together? What masterpieces were lost because of that separation? But that question misunderstands the reality. The music that followed could only exist because of the separation. Art at its most powerful often requires rupture. The greatest irony is that Quincy Jones didn't lose Michael Jackson that night. He completed him. By guiding him to the edge and letting him step off alone, Quincy fulfilled the final role of a true mentor. And Michael Jackson, standing in that dimly lit studio at 11:47 p.m., understood it instinctively. That's why his voice didn't tremble. That's why Quincy froze. Because both men knew this wasn't betrayal. It was graduation. Michael Jackson would go on to redefine what a global artist could be: unapologetic, confrontational, deeply human. Quincy Jones would continue shaping generations of music, carrying the quiet pride of having helped ignite something that outgrew even him. And somewhere in the silence between them, music history found a new direction. The silence that followed their separation didn't echo publicly, but inside Michael Jackson, it roared. In the weeks after that night, Michael didn't slow down. He accelerated. Studios became places of exile and refuge at the same time. He would arrive late, sometimes after midnight, wearing the same black fedora, the same sunglasses, moving through hallways like a shadow that belonged there more than anyone else. Engineers would look up, startled, not because Michael Jackson had entered the room, but because of the intensity he carried with him. This was no longer the Michael who cracked jokes between takes or mimicked instruments with childlike joy, just to make the room laugh. This Michael was on a mission. He spoke less. When he did speak, it was precise, surgical. Every word chosen as carefully as every note. He had notebooks filled with phrases, ideas, rhythms described not in musical terms but emotional ones. This needs to feel like pressure. This should sound like being watched. I want this to hurt, but in a way people dance to. The absence of Quincy Jones wasn't just noticeable, it was defining. For years, Quincy had been the one who translated Michael's internal chaos into something the world could digest. Now, Michael was translating himself and refusing to dilute the message. Executives were uneasy. They listened to early mixes and shifted in their chairs. This wasn't Thriller. This wasn't bad. This wasn't safe. The hooks were there, but they were buried beneath anger, urgency, and a sense of confrontation that made people uncomfortable. Michael noticed. He always noticed. And instead of retreating, he leaned in harder. Because something fundamental had changed in his psychology. That night at 11:47 p.m. had removed his final internal barrier. The need to be validated by the person who helped make him famous. The need to be protected by legacy. Michael Jackson no longer wanted to be the greatest entertainer in the world. He wanted to be the most honest. And honesty, when you're the most famous human being on the planet, is dangerous. The industry began whispering, quietly at first, "He's lost balance. He needs Quincy back." This doesn't sound commercial. These weren't insults, they were warnings disguised as concern. Michael heard them all. But what they didn't understand was that the voice he was listening to now was louder than any executive. His own. Those secret recordings he had mentioned to Quincy, they multiplied, entire vaults of ideas, some unfinished, some raw, some so emotionally charged that Michael would refuse to play them for anyone more than once. He became obsessed with control, not just creative control, but narrative control. Every sound had to mean something. Every lyric had to connect to a deeper truth. Music was no longer entertainment alone. It was defense, confession, protest. And slowly, painfully, it began to isolate him. Friends noticed that Michael trusted fewer people in the studio. Access tightened. Conversations shortened. Laughter became rare. The pressure he once shared with Quincy now sat squarely on his own shoulders. But Michael never complained, because complaining would have implied doubt. And doubt was the one thing he refused to allow back into his life. In private moments, though, late at night, alone with unfinished tracks, Michael wrestled with the ghost of that partnership, not with regret but with reflection. He replayed conversations in his head, remembered moments when Quincy had pushed back, reshaped, redirected. Sometimes he wondered, not if Quincy was wrong, but if Quincy had been right too soon. Great mentors don't just teach you what to do. They teach you what you'll eventually have to do alone. And Michael had reached that point. The public would only begin to understand this transformation years later. They would hear it in the aggression of the beats, in the urgency of the vocals, in the way Michael's voice cracked not from strain but from conviction. But inside the industry, the shift was immediate. Michael Jackson was no longer predictable. And unpredictability is the one thing corporations fear more than failure. Every decision became a negotiation, every release a gamble. Without Quincy's reputation acting as insurance, Michael's ideas were scrutinized more harshly, but he no longer softened them to make others comfortable. Comfort was the enemy. The psychological cost of this independence was immense. Michael began to internalize every criticism. Every lukewarm reaction felt personal. Every suggestion sounded like an attempt to cage him again. This hyper-awareness fed his perfectionism until it became relentless. Songs were mixed, scrapped, rebuilt, re-recorded. Vocals layered dozens of times not for polish, but for emotional accuracy. If a single breath didn't feel right, the take was discarded. Engineers would later say that working with Michael during this period felt like standing too close to a lightning storm. Electrifying, terrifying, unforgettable, and always intense. Michael Jackson was chasing something invisible, an alignment between who he was, what he felt, and what the world heard. That alignment had eluded him for decades, until he stopped asking permission. The night with Quincy Jones was the final severing of a psychological umbilical cord, painful, necessary, inevitable. And yet, despite everything, Michael never spoke publicly about that conversation. He never framed it as conflict. He never diminished Quincy's role in his life. Because deep down, Michael understood something few artists ever articulate. You don't escape your mentors. You carry them forward, or you redefine yourself in response to them. Michael did both. Quincy Jones' influence remained embedded in Michael's discipline, his respect for structure, his understanding of musical architecture. But the emotional direction, the moral compass, now belonged solely to Michael. And that autonomy shaped everything. As the years passed, the myth grew. Fans speculated. Journalists invented narratives. Some painted Quincy as the restraining force. Others cast Michael as reckless without him. The truth was far more complex. Their partnership didn't fail. It completed its purpose. Quincy helped Michael become the greatest pop artist in history. Michael left Quincy to become something else entirely. A cultural force who challenged power, exposed injustice, and refused to remain silent, even when silence would have been safer. That choice came at a price. But Michael paid it willingly. Because on that night at 11:47 p.m. when he said, "I want you to understand something," what he was really saying was this: I can't be who I'm meant to be if I stay who you need me to be. And Quincy Jones, frozen in that moment, understood. That understanding, shared, painful, unspoken, was the true ending of their legendary collaboration. Not anger, not betrayal, just truth. If you've stayed with this story until now, it means you understand that history isn't shaped only by triumphs, but by the moments when people choose growth over comfort. The story doesn't end with independence. It deepens. Because once Michael Jackson crossed that invisible line, once he chose truth over protection, he discovered something far more unsettling than resistance from the industry. He discovered himself. And self-discovery at his level of fame was not liberating in the way people imagine. It was destabilizing. Michael had spent most of his life reacting to expectations, to deadlines, to visions other people helped shape. Now, for the first time, he was initiating, Every creative decision originated from him. Every risk carried his name alone. There was no Quincy Jones to absorb the shockwave if something failed. That weight changed how Michael slept, how he spoke, how he listened. Studio nights stretched longer, not because of indecision, but because Michael refused to leave until the sound in his head existed outside of it. Engineers recalled moments when Michael would sit motionless for minutes after playback ended, eyes closed, breathing shallow, as if measuring the distance between intention and execution. Sometimes he would whisper, "It's close, not there yet." Close wasn't enough anymore. What most people never understood was that Michael Jackson wasn't chasing novelty. He was chasing alignment. The alignment between the boy who grew up under blinding lights and the man who now understood how power worked, how it manipulated, exploited, and erased. The themes emerging from his music after the Quincy era weren't accidental. They were inevitable. Isolation, surveillance, control, moral authority, rage masked as rhythm. Michael wasn't becoming darker. He was becoming clearer. And clarity is dangerous when you're worshipped as an icon. The public wanted magic, Michael wanted meaning. That tension between what the world demanded and what his conscience required became the central conflict of his later work. Without Quincy's guiding hand, Michael stopped sanding down the edges. He let them cut. But clarity came with exposure. The more Michael revealed in his art, the more the world felt entitled to dissect him as a person. His appearance, his lifestyle, his psychology. The same media that once celebrated his perfection now questioned his stability. Michael noticed the shift immediately. And it hurt. Because despite his fierce independence, Michael never stopped wanting to be understood. That desire, the very thing that led him to confront Quincy Jones, remained his deepest vulnerability. The difference now was that he no longer compromised his art to satisfy it. Instead, he turned the pain into fuel. Tracks grew more layered, lyrics more pointed, rhythms more confrontational. Michael Jackson wasn't whispering his discomfort anymore. He was embedding it into the DNA of his music. And audiences responded. Not always with comfort, but with attention. This was the paradox of Michael's post-Quincy era. The more honest he became, the more polarized the response grew. Some listeners felt alienated. Others felt seen for the first time. Michael accepted both reactions as necessary. Because he understood something few entertainers ever do. Art that pleases everyone rarely changes anyone. Still, the cost accumulated quietly. Without a long-standing collaborator to push back, Michael became increasingly isolated in decision-making. Trust narrowed. Circles tightened. He relied more heavily on his instincts, which were extraordinary, but also on his emotions, which were volatile. Perfectionism intensified into obsession. There were moments, documented quietly by those who worked closest with him, when Michael questioned whether he had gone too far. Not creatively, but psychologically, whether independence had come at the expense of connection. In those moments, the ghost of that studio night would resurface. Not as regret, as gravity. Because Michael understood that once you step fully into yourself, there's no returning to who you were before. The boy who once needed Quincy Jones to translate his genius had disappeared. In his place stood a man who knew exactly what he wanted to say, and how much it would cost to say it. That cost extended beyond music. The more Michael asserted his autonomy, the more scrutiny followed. Power structures don't like unpredictability, especially not from someone with global influence, especially not from someone who refused to play the role they'd written for him. Michael's refusal to remain silent, to remain agreeable, made him a problem. And problems get investigated. The pressure didn't break him immediately, but it changed him. He became more guarded in interviews, more careful with words, less accessible. Fame had always isolated him, but now conviction did too. And yet, despite everything, Michael never abandoned his belief in music as a moral force. He still believed sound could heal, that rhythm could unite, that truth, when sung loud enough, could break through distortion. That belief sustained him. It's important to understand this when looking back at the end of the Quincy Jones partnership. That night wasn't a rejection of collaboration. It was a rejection of containment. Michael didn't stop working with others. He stopped being shaped by fear. Quincy Jones represented excellence, discipline, and structure. Michael absorbed all of it, but what Michael needed next couldn't be taught. It had to be claimed. And that claiming, quiet, firm, irreversible, began with a single sentence spoken at 11:47 p.m. "I want you to understand something." Those words were not a challenge. They were a boundary. Quincy Jones understood immediately because he had spent his life watching artists cross that threshold. Most never made it. They either stayed safe or self-destructed. Michael chose a third path. Confrontation without collapse. Evolution without apology. And history, in all its cruelty and brilliance, would respond accordingly. Today, when people revisit Michael Jackson's later work, they often frame it through controversy or spectacle. But stripped of noise, what remains is a man who refused to let success dictate his voice. A man who understood that legacy isn't built by repeating what worked, but by risking what matters. The partnership with Quincy Jones didn't end because of ego. It ended because of inevitability. Some collaborations are meant to carry you to the summit. They are not meant to define what you do once you see the view. Michael Jackson saw the view, and he chose to walk forward, alone. The aftermath of that choice followed Michael Jackson everywhere, even when no one else could see it. Long after the studio lights were turned off, long after engineers packed up and security locked the doors, Michael would sit alone with unfinished mixes playing softly through headphones. In those moments, the noise of the world fell away, and only intention remained. He wasn't listening as a performer anymore. He was listening as a witness to his own transformation. What haunted him wasn't the absence of Quincy Jones. It was the certainty that there was no one left to stop him from going too far. That realization brought both freedom and fear. Michael understood restraint. He had lived under it his entire life. But restraint chosen is different from restraint imposed. Without external limits, he had to invent his own. And inventing boundaries when you are driven by perfection is one of the hardest disciplines an artist can face. Yet he kept going. Not because it was easy, but because turning back would have meant denying the man he had become. When fans later described Michael's music as more intense, more emotional, more raw, they were sensing the residue of that night, the moment when responsibility shifted entirely onto his shoulders. Every note carried intention. Every lyric carried weight. Nothing was casual anymore. And still, beneath all that seriousness, there remained something fragile: hope. Michael never stopped believing that people would eventually hear what he was trying to say. That beneath the spectacle and the controversy, they would recognize the human voice reaching out through the noise. That belief was his anchor. The story of Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones is often told as a breakup, a disagreement, a clash of egos. But the truth is quieter and far more profound. It was a moment of recognition between two men who understood that the same path cannot carry two different futures. Quincy helped Michael become extraordinary. Michael had to leave Quincy to become authentic. And authenticity, once chosen, reshapes everything. If you've stayed with this story through every layer, every silence, every turning point, please like this video. Share it with someone who believes music can change the world, and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these long-form documentary stories alive. Stories about courage, conflict, and the moments when artists choose who they really are.